Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 272. This week the questions are taken from guides 336 and 337. That's the Russian ship General Admiral and the American USS New York armoured cruiser. And then the Wednesday videos on the longitude problem and the history and development of the 5-inch 38 gun, with a question or two thrown in from the Learning About the Royal Navy Introductory Book Recommendations video from Friday. BK Zhong asks, have there ever been efforts by navies to salvage fuel from enemy vessels that were sunk or otherwise significantly damaged as opposed to captured? Not in the sense of reusing the fuel for themselves for the most part. Obviously, post-war, there have been attempts to recover fuel, especially oil, from wrecks of ships that have sunk in areas where either continuous leakage or the eventual degradation of those oil tanks might cause some fairly major problems. But in terms of, you know, we have sunk or crippled this ship and now we're going to go and steal fuel from it, that's not really a thing. Captured, yes. There's plenty of accounts of ships taking on fuel from other ships that they've captured in one way or another, either under fire or under threat of fire. But the problem is, once a ship has sunk or has been badly damaged and presumably is taking on a fair bit of water, one, there's a good chance that the fuel, whether it be coal or oil, has been contaminated with salt water. With oil, that's basically a stop at that point, unless you're exceptionally desperate. With coal, in theory, you could dry it out, but it's going to be probably far more trouble than it's worth unless, again, you're absolutely short on fuel. And the other problem is that, obviously, if a ship has been badly damaged or worse, sunk, so it's probably not upright and certainly not at its original waterline level, getting onto the ship and maintaining stability while you're manoeuvring through the ship probably isn't going to be very easy or very safe. And with oil, for example, you know, ships don't tend to carry equipment that will allow them to burrow deep into an enemy vessel to access its oil tanks and then pump it all out. So if you were going to take diesel or oil fuel off of a ship, you would have to do that, if you could at all, via the pumps and pipe work systems that the ship already has. But those generally require the ship to be at least upright and stable, and ideally under its own power as well. Now, there are one or two instances of ships that were badly damaged and had gone aground having their fuel salvaged back in the days of coal-powered vessels, but whether that was done by enemy warships during a time of action is, as far as I know, not a thing. Albeit, you know, one or two rare cases might have occurred, especially in something like, say, the Crimean War, perhaps in the Sea of Azov campaign. If a steamship's been sunk in shallow water in one of the Crimean ports or one of the Sea of Azov ports, I can see the captain of a gunboat or other shallow draft small vessel sending his men over with a boat to pick up a few sacks of coal just to top up his own supplies. Master Scrain asks, how many ships of the same name were lost during World War I or World War II? I know there were 2 US destroyers named Meredith lost during the Second World War. For this, you almost exclusively have to look at destroyers because in both World Wars, it's conceivable to lose a destroyer relatively early in the war, build a new one with a new name, or at least rename one on the stocks, and have that in combat long enough for it to see enough action that it may get sunk. You'd have to be spectacularly unlucky to lose a cruiser, build a new cruiser, and then lose that one as well. Now, that's not to say that some didn't come close. One or two of the US carriers that were named for carriers that had been sunk earlier in the war came disturbingly close to being sunk later on by kamikazes. you've got the Meredith from the US Navy. For the Royal Navy, you have the Gurkha and the Hardy, both Royal Navy destroyers, lost, ironically enough, the originals, both of them off of or within the fjords of Norway, and then their successors were also sunk during the war. Although if you want cruisers, technically speaking, you could argue SMS Karlsruhe of World War I fame, because you have the original Karlsruhe, which was, well, actually just sank due to spontaneous explosion in 1914. She was then replaced by a Königsberg class, well, one of the many Königsberg classes the Germans have built, but the mid-World War I Königsberg class SMS Karlsruhe, and she was scuttled in Scapa Flow, so, sunk after the November armistice, but before the final documents had been signed by her own crew. That may kind of count. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, historically, the construction of Bismarck was hampered when the Germans had to make sacrifices to the ship's design in order to get it to fit through the Kiel canal. Given that Germany's naval plans weren't exactly looking to downsize anything, why didn't the Germans expand the Kiel canal, or was that a project they simply never got around to? With the Kiel canal, it's a slightly different problem compared to the Panama Canal. In fact, well, when you look at the costs of expanding the capacity of the Panama Canal to deal with larger ships, and to a certain extent the time it took to do them, that's basically a tithe of the effort that you would need to deal with the Kiel Canal. Because with the Panama Canal, until you enter the realms of the truly absurdly sized ships, the main problem, the main restriction for Panamax ships, if you like, is the width of the locks, which is why you have the restricted beam on US fast battleships and carriers until, obviously, post-World War II, the canal locks are expanded somewhat. But the locks are, relative to the Panama Canal, small fixed structures with a certain amount of work that needs to be done to expand them. The problem with the Kiel Canal wasn't so much the locks, because although pre-World War I the locks would have been far too small, they had been expanded just before World War I to accommodate World War I era dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, so it wasn't the locks that were the problem for the Kiel Canal. The problem with the Kiel Canal is its depth, which is why Bismarck is actually well over Panamax beam width, but its draft is not quite as much as some of its contemporaries. And that's simply, as I said, because the Kiel Canal is too shallow. And that's not a problem you can easily fix. The Suez Canal has had similar issues in the past and has, at great expense over considerable amounts of time, been enlarged. But essentially, for the Kiel Canal to accommodate a overall larger dimension vessel, getting a ship that's a bit longer than Bismarck and getting a ship that is a bit wider than Bismarck down it during the Second World War, not too much of a problem. Getting a ship with a much deeper draft by more than a foot or two, that's going to be your issue. And if you're going to increase the depth of the Kiel Canal, then even if you don't want to actually widen it any further, and realistically when you're deepening a canal or any kind of waterway, you do want to widen it as well, otherwise you risk making the banks steeper underwater if you're retaining the same width, which means there's a greater chance of infall, etc. But even if you're just, effectively dredging it out, although you're not going to be using dredgers because you're obviously going to be digging as well, then, well, the thing's over 100 kilometers long. Digging up that much canal and the sheer disruption to shipping that would be caused by having to close the canal whilst you dug away, that's an absolutely huge engineering project. And even the expansion that was done pre-World War I took about 5 to 7 years, depending on your source. So Germany in the 1930s, they didn't have the time and they didn't have the money, and they probably didn't have the resources either to go significantly deepening the entire length of the Kiel Canal to a nice even depth to accommodate ships with, say, a 35, 36 foot draft or deeper. Potato Served Raw asks, why didn't the Allies or Japanese use auxiliary cruisers in the Pacific? I think it would have had some success attacking merchant ships for both sides, Japan especially considering the fact they used suicide tactics and didn't really follow the Geneva Convention most of the time. Well, for the Allies, it was because the Japanese trade, for the most part, took place within Japanese-occupied areas, and to get there, you would have to go past the outer perimeter, usually, and that meant going past the Japanese Navy, who would take a relatively dim view of random merchant ships coming in from areas that they didn't control. And then once you were in there, assuming you managed to sneak through, you've got the problem that the Japanese, for all their other faults when it came to convoys, had actually organised convoys with escorts pretty quickly, even if they weren't particularly good at anti-submarine warfare, and random merchant ships rocking up would be incredibly suspicious. Whereas, the Allies had aircraft and submarines in relatively large numbers, which were much more effective in that role. Now, conversely, the Japanese theoretically might have had some early success with armed merchant cruisers, and indeed the Japanese did actually deploy a number of armed merchant cruisers, auxiliary cruisers if you will, but their operations against Allied shipping only tended to occur in the very, very early part of the Japanese involvement in World War II. For similar-ish reasons, a Japanese auxiliary cruiser would have to bypass the Allied warships on the front line, and then the Pacific is an exceptionally large place, and the Indian Ocean's pretty big as well, so you'd have to find where the Allied ships were, and on top of that, of course, the Allies also, by this stage, 1941-42, were pretty good at escorting their ships in convoys. So, whilst a few lone ships did get caught by Japanese auxiliary cruisers early on, it pretty much died a death fairly quickly. Plus, the Japanese were so short of merchant hulls that the vast majority of ships they did turn into armed merchant cruisers didn't actually go on any long-distance Hilfskreuzer-style voyages. They were instead put straight into action, either escorting convoys, i.e. this is the armed merchant ship, it's escorting all the other merchant ships, or at least part of the escort, or they were doing second-line patrols, or being used actually as transports, just with a little bit of self-defense capability. The thing that allowed the Hilfskreuzer to exist and work to a certain degree was the fact that the Germans knew they were pretty much blockaded in, and so they didn't really need a colossal merchant fleet that were ocean-going vessels outside of the occasional blockade runner. And also, obviously, Allied trade had to go to various areas that were relatively close to or within contested waters, like the UK, which made the Hilfskreuzer's job a lot easier. There's no equivalent to the UK, think of how close the UK is to Germany. There's no equivalent Allied-held territory that close to Japan that would draw merchant shipping in to a point that a Hilfskreuzer of a Japanese design could actually successfully really operate. Now, of course, some Hilfskreuzer did operate in the Indian and Pacific Oceans for a while, but the more successful voyages tended to be earlier in the war, before the Allies fully convoyed everything everywhere when they realised what the threat was, and also the fact that until the Japanese joined the war, statistically speaking, it was relatively unlikely that you would run into a German vessel above or below the water in the Indian or Pacific Oceans, and so they felt a little bit more lax about it, whereas once Japan had joined the war, the chances of running into a hostile vessel in the Indian and Pacific Oceans went up a lot more, which obviously necessitated the extension of convoys of the heavily escorted variety. Wayne's World of Sci-Fi Tech asks, how would you rate the USS New York ACR-2 design based on the technology and industry available to the US Navy at the time? This can be a little bit difficult to do because of two main factors. Firstly, this was the US Navy's second ever armoured cruiser, and they were coming off a long period of not building any major capital ships, the first obviously being Maine. So in some ways you have to make a certain amount of allowance for that. You know, navies that are building a first ship of its type when they've got no real previous experience or very limited, I think there always has to be a certain amount of allowance made, which is why, for example, some of the early German pre-dreadnoughts with 9.4-inch guns, although they are objectively not really particularly good designs, based on, you know, the performance of all the other pre-dreadnoughts around them, I tend to cut them a bit more slack because Germany barely existed as a country. It was almost a newborn state at that point, let alone, you know, actually building full-scale battleships. But nevertheless, back to USS New York, the other issue is that when she's built, starting in 1890, so basically the first half of the 1890s, not that many other people are actually building armoured cruisers. The British have kind of given up on the idea and gone over to building very large protected cruisers. They won't re-enter the armoured cruiser game for a few more years hence, which makes comparison with a British armoured cruiser relatively unfair, because you'd either be comparing something that was a technological generation behind, still using compound armour like the Orlandos, or you'd be skipping forward to the end of the 1890s, at which point, you know, the Harvey steel has given way to Krupp steel, quick-firing guns, etc., etc., etc. So either way would be a bit unfair. There's a bit of a tertiary issue as well, in that the New York is actually a very large vessel for its type. Not overall, later armoured cruisers would be significantly larger, but in the early 1890s, having a armoured cruiser that is 8,000 to 9,000 tons displacement is actually remarkably large, even for the powers that are building armoured cruisers at the time. So, with all that in mind, the best comparisons approximately that I could find would be the almost exact contemporary French Depuis de l'Homme and the slightly later Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi designs. Now, there are, technically speaking, both of the French and Italian navies, armoured cruisers that are a little bit more on the nose in terms of exact builder dates compared to the New York, but they are much, much smaller ships, and therefore any direct comparison is going to be hilariously unfair. Whereas these ships are, you know, roughly within the technological bracket that New York falls under, even if they're a little bit smaller, but not hugely compared to some other vessels. Now, with that said, let's do a simple comparison. Speed, protection, firepower. You know, it's a crude one, but it works as a general analysis. Speed-wise, New York is capable of 20 knots. So's the Giuseppe Garibaldi class, so's Depuis de l'Homme. So, you know, spot on there. Its speed is pretty much identical to contemporary, roughly similar vessels. Protection. Now, this is an interesting one, in that New York and Depuis de l'Homme have almost identical thicknesses of belt armour, whereas the Giuseppe Garibaldis have belt armour that's about 50% thicker. However, on the flip side, the Garibaldis have, and Depuis de l'Homme actually have relatively thin armoured decks, whereas New York has a fairly substantial armoured deck. So, although the Garibaldis have slightly better belt armour, the fact that Depuis de l'Homme is almost identical shows you New York is competing pretty well on the belt armour front, and its deck armour is, as I said, you know, remarkably thick. And then we come to firepower. Now, firepower is an interesting one because whilst a lot of armoured cruisers in some ways resemble mini pre-dreadnoughts in that they have, you know, a pair of guns forward, a pair of guns aft, just a bit smaller, and then the secondary and tertiary batteries tend to be of roughly the same or even identical guns, just with slightly fewer of them, New York breaks that trend a little bit. So compared to Giuseppe Garibaldi, her primary firepower, depending on the variant, but let's take the most normal one, would have a pair of twin 8-inch guns forward and a pair aft, and then its secondary battery is an extensive set of 6-inch quick-firing guns, and then a whole bunch of various anti-torpedo boat guns lower down. Depuis de l'Homme is not massively different. She's got a pair of single 7.6-inch guns, one fore, one aft, which is relatively typical for French armoured cruisers of this period. She is the smallest of the three, so having singles instead of twins is perhaps somewhat understandable on top of the fact that she has a tumble home. She also has the smallest secondary battery, her 6 single 6.4-inch 164mm guns, but they are all in turrets as opposed to encasement, so, swings and roundabouts, then your big battery of anti-torpedo boat quick-firing small guns. But you get the general idea that the secondary battery is this kind of 6-ish inch, give or take a little bit, range. New York has a pair of twin 8-inch fore, pair of twin 8-inch aft. That's fairly standard. However, she also has a pair of single 8-inch, one on each beam in open mounts. Now, for that, I'm actually going to give New York points. That's actually a good move, in my opinion. Now, you can make an argument that those guns are somewhat exposed because they're on open mountings, which would be true if she's taking fire. However, because they're on open mountings, they also can elevate just as well as the guns and the turrets, possibly even slightly better. But the main point is that she can do a unified broadside, whereas even over a decade later, when the Germans are building the Scharnhorst class, they go for a somewhat similar setup where they stick single guns of the main battery caliber on the sides of the ship, but they put them in casements which, okay, are more heavily armoured, granted, but also have elevation issues, so they can't do a unified broadside out to maximum range, which is something of a downside. So, I'm going to give New York points for that particular design feature because it's actually a relatively good one in my opinion and quite forward-thinking. But then when you come to the secondary battery, whilst it does have, the normal small anti-torpedo boat guns, the secondary battery is large at 12 guns, but they are only 4-inch, as opposed to the, as I said before, 6-inch, give or take a little bit, that almost everybody else at this point is putting on their secondaries. Now, that is a little bit interesting. However, I personally think that that design decision was probably the right one for the US Navy at the time, even though, in keeping with your question, it does reflect a little bit negatively on the technology available to the US Navy at the time. And the reason I say that is because the reason the 6-inch guns feature on the other ships and feature on a lot of other large cruisers, if you looked at the British protected cruisers of this period, is that those guns have the quick-firing technological developments incorporated into them. If you look at the 6-inch guns available to the US Navy in 1890, they have a incredibly slow rate of fire. You're talking what, if you're looking at 20th century warships, would be considered battleship levels of fire, i.e. battleship main turret levels of rate of fire, or possibly even worse, depending on the exact variant and how you're mounting them. Which means that, given that the purpose of the secondary battery is partially to engage your enemy in a hail of fire and partially to help with like big hitting power against torpedo boats, yeah, I can understand why they didn't put the 6-inch gun on in 1890. So, it's a little bit of a swings and roundabouts case, because if the US had slightly more technically developed guns in the 1890s, they could have put a 6-inch secondary battery on with quick-firing tech, but since they didn't, they made the right choice, in my opinion, of instead of just sticking on some inadequate guns, but hey, they're the same caliber as everyone else, they stuck on a bunch of very rapid fire for the time period guns, which then would fulfill the anti-torpedo boat role quite well. And hey, if you've got, 6 per side guns shooting that many high explosive shells, which is what most secondary batteries would be doing in a armoured cruiser versus armoured cruiser engagement, or armoured cruiser versus cruiser engagement, okay, the individual 4-inch shell might not do a huge amount more of damage compared to a 6-inch high explosive shell, but there's going to be an awful lot of them. So the chances of you scoring a hit go up. So overall, a decent choice. Thus, my overall analysis of the New York is that she actually is a pretty respectable armoured cruiser for her period, and actually probably in the top third of armoured cruisers if you take 1890 plus or minus, say, 5 years. She's probably easily in the top third, maybe even higher, because she's a very capable ship. Now, granted, some of that comes from the fact she's quite large, but there's a lot of good design choices going in there. My only two minor quibbles would be, as I said, it would have been better if they could have got 6-inch quick-firing guns in a little bit earlier, but since they didn't, okay, the 4-inch battery is acceptable. And the other thing is that, whilst, yes, her deck armour is hilariously thick compared to a lot of other ships of the period, it maybe was a little bit overdone. Not that you don't want to reduce the protection available to your crew by all that much, but perhaps a fraction of weight could have been saved there that could have been put into other things, like maybe giving the 8-inch guns on either side a little bit more protection, which I think could have been done while still leaving the deck armour substantially better than most of its contemporaries. His dad James asks, why do battleships tend to have a proportionally low freeboard? I can imagine certain advantages and disadvantages, like presenting a smaller target or having poorer seakeeping, but why don't such trade-offs apply equally to large cruisers? Essentially because for warships, it just becomes a law of diminishing returns past a certain point. With freeboard, which, for those of you who aren't aware, is the distance between the surface of the sea and the upper limit of the continuous hull, which can be measured at the bow, and obviously in the case of ships with a upswept bow, that will be considerably higher, but is also measured amidships and sometimes at the stern as well, for obvious reasons, because you look at something like Hood, has a slightly upswept bow, so it's going to have a considerably higher freeboard at the front than it would amidships, than it would aft, and the same thing with something like, say, an Iowa class. But when it comes to freeboard, which obviously helps with seakeeping because it helps keep the sea on either side of the ship rather than coming over the top, which obviously can infiltrate into the ship, but also will slow it down quite significantly in rough weather. Essentially what you have is that for most seas, you need a certain amount of freeboard to be able to deal with them, somewhere between 20 and 30 feet, depending on the sea conditions, etc., 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 and on what your design is like. If you've got a very long, very narrow bow, you might need more freeboard forward than if you've got a slightly fuller bow, for example. Basically, if the bow plunges or the wave gets high enough, if you've got a very narrow, negatively buoyant bow, you might need more height because it'll take longer before the ship actually starts lifting up. But in any case, once you go past that point, whatever you've calculated it to be, whilst having an even higher ship in terms of its hull will obviously mean you have better seakeeping. Every inch you make a armoured gun-based warship taller in the hull is another inch that the really big, really heavily armoured bits, like the turrets, have to be above the ship's centre of gravity, the waterline, and the metacentric height. And that means the ship will gradually become more and more unstable. Also, the taller the ship, obviously, the longer you need the barbettes to be, because the barbettes have to protect the shell hoists all the way down to the magazines, which are going to be under the water. And what this means is that on a lot of destroyers, not all, because you do get flush deck destroyers, the US is especially fond of these, but on destroyers you'll have a very, very high bow that will rapidly sweep down, and then you usually have a break somewhere, which means that the quarterdeck will end up being significantly lower than the bow. For cruisers, you can have, again, either broken deck cruisers or flush deck cruisers. And for battleships, usually, at least by World War II, you'll have that upper deck continuing all the way through, even if it's got a bit of a slope to it. On a lot of older ships and on battle cruisers like Hood, you will still have that quarterdeck step down. But you don't need to go any higher. So let's say, arbitrarily, you decide that 25 feet is adequate freeboard. Well, 25 feet would then be adequate freeboard for your destroyers, your cruisers, and your battleships, before accounting for any design considerations. But since the battleships tend to be the biggest of the ships, the freeboard that they possess, even if it's the same or potentially with variation, maybe even greater than that of some destroyers and cruisers, will appear to be less, proportionally less, because of the overall extreme size. And similar considerations obviously do apply to the smaller ships like cruisers and destroyers, but the sea doesn't care about the size of the ship, and so the freeboard is, to a certain extent, somewhat independent of the size of the warship. It's not entirely, but as we said, design considerations and the size and layout of the ship might affect things. But broadly speaking, there is a kind of, your bow must be at least this high in order to be a truly ocean-going vessel. Samoilenko asks, were the Yamatos a mistake, or was the Kantai Kessen the thing to blame for the ineffectiveness of Japanese battleships? Were the Yamatos really obsolete for their time, and is the commonly expressed thought that the Yamatos were the biggest battleships built in the age of carriers true? The idea that the Yamatos are obsolete for their time isn't really correct at all, because people think of them mostly in the context of Sibayan Sea, Samar, and Tango towards the end of the Second World War. They sort of arrive at this slightly false impression that the Yamatos are very late battleships, and the endless comparisons of Iowa versus Yamato also makes people think that they are contemporaries. And yes, they're contemporary in as much as they both were active during the Second World War, but in fact, in terms of battleship generations, the Iowas are considerably later and considerably younger than the Yamatos. When you look at the dates that the various battleships are laid down, launched, and commissioned, in terms of when they're laid down, the Yamatos are actually contemporary with the North Carolina class battleships. In fact, in both classes, the first and second ships are laid down in 1937 and 1938. Obviously, the North Carolina class build a little bit faster. That's not exactly surprising, considering that they are about half the displacement, with North Carolina commissioning in April 41 and Washington in May 41. But Yamato is not that far behind. She also commissions in December 41. And then Musashi commissions in mid-1942. And if you want to go a stage further, to the South Dakotas, the Yamatos are laid down a year to a year and a half before the South Dakotas. Yamato commissions pretty much in the middle of the South Dakotas being launched, and Musashi commissions towards the tail end of the South Dakotas being commissioned. And then if you move forward once more to the Iowas, their great fictional nemesis, the Iowas are actually the last two that are actually fully completed, Missouri and Wisconsin, are actually laid down less than a year before Yamato commissions. Yamato and Musashi are actually both commissioned and in service before the first Iowa is even launched, let alone completed. And if you account for Illinois and Kentucky, well, Yamato is actually fully in commission before either of them, and Musashi is in commission before Illinois is laid down. And at the time of their being laid down, and arguably even at the time of their commissioning, the battleship is by no means an obsolete weapon, and I would say the age of the carrier hasn't actually fully dawned, because by the time they're both in commission, so mid-1942, the only underway capital ships that have actually been sunk by air attack are Prince of Wales and Repulse, Force Z, about 6 months before Musashi is commissioned and around about the same time that Yamato is being commissioned. But, as I've covered in my Force Z video, those ships are sunk not in a kind of, if you like, quote-unquote, fair engagement, in as much as anything in war is fair, but, you know, they have malfunctioning anti-aircraft systems, they don't have any fighter cover or significant anti-aircraft escort because intelligence failures have led them to believe that they don't need it, And even way back in the 30s, it was appreciated that working anti-aircraft systems and either a significant anti-aircraft escort and or fighter cover was necessary. So it's a little bit of an anomalous situation there. So, late 41, early 42, battleships are still very useful. And again, as I pointed out with something like Operation Tango, yes, Yamato was sunk by aircraft carriers in Operation Tango. However, if you add up the total displacement of the carriers that launched aircraft against Yamato and compare it to Yamato's displacement, realistically, Yamato was sunk by massively more tonnage than she herself represented. And if you replaced the tonnage of aircraft carriers with the equivalent tonnage in modern fast battleships, Yamato would still have been just as sunk. If you sent 2 Essexes worth of carriers planes at Yamato, would she have survived to the end of the night? Well, there's a possibility. It's a decent possibility. Nonetheless, that's kind of a separate argument perhaps for another video. I think if you want to look at more generally the Yamatos in the context of the ineffectiveness of Japanese battleships, yes, to a certain degree Kantai Kessen is to blame, but also no. So Kantai Kessen, obviously, decisive battle doctrine. The Japanese held back a good chunk of their battleship force, including the Yamatos and Nagatos, from a lot of engagements in order to preserve them. Now, that isn't to say they were completely unused. Look at, for example, who was escorting the invasion force heading for Midway. But when you compare that to the use of especially the Congos, you see a little bit of a disparity. There are other reasons, fuel economy, etc., speed, that some of the Japanese battleships were held back. But ultimately, a big drag was the idea that we have to have the battle fleet ready for the big decisive battle, which, of course, at least in terms of a battle line engagement, never came. But at the same time, decisive battle doctrine didn't specifically say you had to preserve your entire battle line at all costs ready for the big final battle, although having as many capital ships as possible for that battle was ideal. That was just how it was implemented. You could read Kantai Kessen in a way that fully supported the use of your battleships in lesser engagements, as long as you were careful about it, in part because you end up with a chicken and egg situation of, if we keep all our ships back, our big capital ships, for the final battle, that final battle may never arrive because you're essentially ceding a degree of the initiative to the other side. The Americans, therefore, are able to operate some of their battleships, like North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, along with their aircraft carriers to provide anti-aircraft support, for example. Whereas you could argue, if the Japanese use their battleships a bit more proactively, assuming that the fuel situation allowed them to, they could have shaped the campaign in such a way as to perhaps force some kind of, if not decisive, at least major battle line engagement. I mean, let's face it, at least on a tactical level, outside of Midway, which, we know all the various permutations as to what went on there, but outside of that, when you look at Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, Coral Sea, etc., the Japanese, on average, in 1942, could usually pull some kind of tactical victory out of most of the carrier engagements, even if they ended up being strategic defeats quite a bit. Now, whilst Japanese anti-aircraft fire wasn't necessarily the greatest threat on the planet to aircraft compared to some other nations, if you'd had, if you like, mirror match examples where you had multiple Japanese capital ships, as many as they could field, escorting the carriers at Coral Sea, even Midway, Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, etc., the way that you had South Dakota, North Carolina, Washington, etc. tag along with US carrier groups, could that have preserved more of the Japanese carriers for longer and thus allowed them to take more offensive action, perhaps grind the American forces down more? Or when you get to the end of 1942, and American large-scale forces have been ground down quite significantly anyway, perhaps force the Americans to commit to battle in some other way or withdraw from the field for a little bit. Who knows? They didn't do it, and so it never happened. I mean, apart from anything, with the size of 1942 carrier strike groups that actually, made it to their targets, the level of accuracy, etc., etc., if nothing else, the big ships like Nagato, Mutsu, Yamato, Musashi would act as fairly effective diversions and torpedo and bomb soaks, which would possibly help preserve the carriers because they'd probably survive that. Yeah, they'd be in and out of dry dock all the time being repaired. But then you have the question of, is it better for Yamato to eat a couple of torpedoes and 3 or 4 bombs, which it can survive, get back and spend 6 months in dry dock and then come back to repeat the process? Or is it better to preserve Yamato for some nebulous future battle and end up with 2 or 3 carriers blown out of the water underneath you instead? And as I said, it's not even necessarily that the US would just attack them, but if you come out of the clouds, whether that be at Midway or elsewhere, and you look down below you, if the first thing you see is a gigantic battleship spitting anti-aircraft fire at you, you might well be tempted to just go after it, regardless of where exactly the enemy carriers might be. Nicholas Ressar asks, were there any instances of a naval force generating excess smoke to lure an enemy force into a trap or out of position? Yes, this was actually quite common practice, certainly amongst destroyers of various navies. The idea being that obviously a destroyer could, in theory, be shot to pieces by a cruiser or a battleship at a range beyond its effective torpedo launching range, and a destroyer's never going to win a gunfight with such a vessel anyway. So the quandary is, how do you close the distance? Well, one of the ways is you form up in a flotilla and charge and try and close the intervening distance to torpedo launch range and hope that enough of you survive to get your torpedoes off. And or you can have your own cruisers or battleships supporting you to distract the enemy cruisers or battleships from said attack. But that's why the secondary batteries exist. Another way is to generate a big smoke screen in a way that persuades the enemy, or perhaps forces the enemy, to come and either investigate or try and pierce the said smoke screen. But in either case, at least prior to radar, the enemy can't see where you are. And they might assume that you've run away, because that's the other major use of smoke screens, and perhaps the more widespread use is as cover to help you get away from something. Except that either when they get close to the smoke screen, or perhaps when they pass through, they discover that, hey, surprise, the destroyers are right there, or the destroyers come boiling out of the smoke screen at point-blank range and unleash a bunch of torpedoes. Perfect trap, if you can pull it off. In fact, that's one of the things that HMS Glowworm, for example, was trying to do to the cruiser Admiral Hipper. Yes, in part the smoke screen was supposed to try and conceal it from Hipper's guns, but when Glowworm laid that smokescreen, they weren't laying the smokescreen then turning and putting their stern to Hipper and just hightailing it away. They were actually trying to use the cover to get their second torpedo launcher working again so that they could torpedo Hipper. And this tactic was widespread enough that you actually see multiple accounts, especially in the Mediterranean, where there's regular clashes between, half a dozen to a dozen plus ships on either side, and where both sides at various points lay down smoke screens, and in actual fact the smoke screens are there to cover a withdrawal or to at least conceal them from gunfire, but the enemy declines to pursue specifically because of the high risk, at least that the enemy commander perceives, that smoke screen might conceal some kind of trap. And in large-scale fleet engagements, whilst not maybe using an excess of smoke as a smokescreen to lure an enemy out of position, what you might do is lay down a large smokescreen, but perhaps only use 2 or 3 destroyers. But if you lay it down in roughly what might be predicted to be the enemy's path of advance, but not necessarily a path of advance you'd want them to do, then they have to make that estimation for themselves. They don't know what's behind the smoke screen, but can they afford to take the risk? And if they can't, they have to alter course. And if you've done it properly, they'll be altering course in a way that you have predicted they would go and is more favourable to you. Now that's a little bit more complex and does require a fairly significant action for that kind of tactic to be undertaken, because apart from anything, you have to have multiple out-of-position destroyers that you can afford to not have directly engaging, but the use of smoke screens to try and force the enemy to change course in various scales of engagement did occasionally happen. HMS Inconceivable asks, standardized classes of armed and unarmed trawlers. What was the reasoning behind them, and did they start from peacetime requirements or wartime emergencies? There were quite a few lines of reasoning behind the use of trawlers, whether unarmed or armed, and especially if built in standardized classes, and exactly how much pre-war compared to wartime thinking dominated their construction rather depends on which war you're looking at. For example, in World War II, having had the experience of World War I to draw upon, the Royal Navy was much quicker off the mark in getting standardized classes of trawler built than perhaps it was in the First World War. But the various lines of reasoning behind them are, the big ones at least, are the fact that ultimately there are an awful lot of roles in a modern, i.e. early 20th century war that require a naval ship. And that can be minesweeping, it can be basic anti-submarine work, very basic convoy escort, opening and closing torpedo nets and submarine nets at harbours, basic, very local coastal anti-submarine patrol, basic anti-aircraft duty, etc., etc. Lots of little bitty bits of work that require larger numbers of ships. They don't necessarily have to go particularly fast, but they do have to be there. And a big, expensive destroyer, and on the scale of things, a destroyer in this particular role would be a big and expensive asset, which is always in short supply. There just aren't enough of them, and they may not necessarily be the wisest investment of resources, even if you can build loads of destroyers for various jobs. And a trawler, at least at this point in history, is relatively speaking small, relatively speaking cheap. It's got an okay-ish speed, but the machinery is quick and easy to build and easy to maintain. And unlike a lot of other mercantile vessels, because of their normal day-to-day job, hauling large amounts of nets, they've got a fairly decent power-to-weight ratio. If you want to use them to haul things like, let's say, minesweeps, they are already designed to, as I said, haul things behind them, so that's not going to be a massive undue strain on their systems. And because they're supposed to be out in almost all weathers and survive, they tend to be fairly strongly built for mercantile vessels, and they tend to be relatively seaworthy. They may not be the most comfortable vessels to be on, but they'll probably still be there after a storm. And extra attractive for a navy is that because trawlers are designed to haul in large amounts of fish normally and deposit and sort them on their decks tend to be fairly clear, which means there's plenty of space to put guns and depth charge launchers and all other sorts of wonderful things without fundamentally changing the layout of the ship. And of course, because again, trawlers are relatively small vessels, they tend to be quite a lot of them in the civilian world, so in the first instance, if you need lots of ships very quickly, trawlers are probably the single largest body of ships to draw upon, but also if you need a lot of men quickly, fishermen are probably the largest body of sailors that you can quickly and easily draw upon, that you can afford to transfer roles to, because a decrease in the amount of fish that your population has available to you might be a bit irritating, but if you take large amounts of your transoceanic merchant marine away, you physically can't trade, which is a much bigger problem. And of course, what kind of vessels are local fishermen usually used to? Trawlers. So if you build an armed trawler class, especially if it's one that's based on an existing mercantile form, and you've just drafted in several thousand fishermen, and you say, right, well, we want you to do this, this, and this, providing them a ship that they're essentially pretty familiar with already is going to massively cut down on the amount of training time that you need to give them. You just need to tell them how to operate the weapons and what their basic duties are. And if you're being very, very far-minded, of course, the fact is that even though they're fairly robust for their size, trawlers are relatively vulnerable vessels, so the unarmed trawlers that are still out there doing fishing, etc., etc., they're probably going to suffer a fairly high attrition rate from enemy raiders, submarines, aircraft, depending on the war. And at the end of the war, when you release your thousands of fishermen, or tens of thousands even, back into regular civilian life, well, if you've got a bunch of naval trawlers, you can probably sell them off for something better than scrap value, which will replenish your trawler fleet and maybe pay back a bit of the money you've invested in them, as opposed to building your own purpose-built escort, which might require considerably more work to repurpose into a civilian role, which is going to affect its sale price. Ash the Lego guy asks, was Project-Operation Hula really necessary for the war effort, even if the Manhattan Project had never worked out? So for those of you who aren't aware of what it was, Project Hula was a transfer of a variety of US Navy vessels to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, ideally they wanted it to join in the invasion of Japan, which obviously got curtailed by the atomic bombs, but assuming they didn't work, they wanted the Soviet Union to help them invade Japan, except that the Soviet Pacific Fleet was a little bit short on things like anti-submarine frigates and landing craft, and so the US Navy decided, well, the best way of doing it is to transfer a bunch of assets to them. As for whether or not that was necessary for the war effort, strictly speaking, no. On absolute terms, the Americans and British and the other Western allies were capable of invading the Japanese home islands on their own, without Soviet assistance. But, to slightly paraphrase, in order that YouTube doesn't completely demonetize the video, one does not win wars by dying for one's country. One wins wars by making the other guy die for his country. Now, that's one element. That's, our Western Allied invasion of Japan. However, you could say a corollary to that, and perhaps, at least if you are America, Britain, France, etc., the addition, and perhaps a superior version to that, is that you don't win the war by dying for your country, you win the war by making one of your other allies go and fight, and hopefully they will make the enemy die for their country, and any of them who fall in the attempt, well, they're dying for their country as well, but in neither case are your people dying for your country. You've got two different sets of people, each dying for their countries. Doesn't really affect you all that much, except for the fact that your overall strategic objective is secured. Now, it's a cold and ruthless calculation, but that is exactly the kind of calculation that goes on in war. And when you look at the projected scale of casualties from Operation Olympic, Operation Downfall, the ideas that were percolating around for the invasion of Japan, anything that was going to reduce that would be seen as a good idea. And if that meant, handing over several hundred landing craft and frigates to the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union could invade the northern part of Japan and force some of the Japanese resources to go off and kill Soviet servicemen instead of killing British and American servicemen, well, a few hundred lumps of metal and engines are probably a small price to pay compared to the number of lives that could have saved, at least from the British and American side of things. It might have caused overall net more casualties, because let's face it, the Soviet naval invasion would not have anything like the level of anti-aircraft and surface support that the Anglo-American invasion would have had. But as I said, if you're the Anglo-Americans planning all of this, you probably don't care as much about the Soviet lives that will be lost as you do about the ones of your own that are being kept around. Greb asks, while watching a video about the operation of the USS Texas's main battery, it showed adding a firing cap, or perhaps a percussion cap, to the closed breech. Did German naval guns do the same, or is the percussion cap part of the brass case? And how did British main batteries do it? Etc., etc. Generally speaking, if you have a brass case, either containing the whole of your charge, or perhaps in the case of a lot of German battleship guns as the last portion of your charge, that typically will have a primer built into it at the base. I'm not 100% sure offhand whether the battleship charges had this, but I mean, on the one hand, it wouldn't surprise me because it's an evolution of just the separated ammunition type you can see here. On the other hand, having a live primer in the base charge for a gun of battleship scale seems like perhaps a less than wise decision, so perhaps it was removable and inserted at some point during the ammunition hoisting or insertion process. I don't know offhand. Maybe someone in the comments can tell us. But on a much broader scale, whether you're the Germans and you've decided to use your brass cases for your big battleship guns, or you're most other people using purely bag charges, you do need some kind of primer to set off the whole charge. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a percussion cap. It would be a percussion primer, because a percussion cap basically brings to mind a tiny little thing you stick on a rifle or maybe on an early cannon, whereas the primer that you would use on a battleship charge, if you imagine a relatively large caliber rifle bullet and then you just take the bullet out of its case and you're just left with the case containing the charge, what would actually be the full charge for the bullet, that's near enough as makes no difference roughly what you'd be using to set off a battleship's main gun propellant. If you like, a blank round with a bit more oomph in it. And that normally can be inserted separately into the breech as opposed to just the whole breech opening and closing. So you can have the shell loaded, charges loaded, you can close up the breech, and then you can also put in the primer. It's almost a separate mini breech within a breech, depending on the time period and the exact navy in question. And obviously that has certain safety advantages, because in theory then the gun shouldn't fire unless and until you have inserted that primer, which does make the whole operation a little bit safer. You're not going to drop a charge in a bag and accidentally blow up the turret, for example. Now, exactly where, when, and how you insert that primer varies quite a lot depending on the gun in question and the navy in question and the time in question. But if you look at various diagrams or even pictures, if you know what you're looking for, of various gun breeches or breech blocks, you should be able to work out which is which. The main difference in the early part of the 20th century, i.e. in the run-up to World War I, was that some navies, particularly the Americans, and to a lesser extent the Royal Navy, preferred having primers that were fired electrically. So they'd have a very, very, very fine powder mix and essentially use an electric circuit that had a superheating wire element to set it off. This has certain advantages because it means obviously your centralized fire control. They can pull a trigger, press a button, send an electric circuit through the ship, everything goes off. Also makes interrupter circuits and so forth to stagger the firing of the guns very much easier to implement, whereas other navies stuck around with purely percussion based ones for a while. So you would have to physically pull a lanyard to fire the gun. And if you look at training videos and so forth from at least the World War I period, you'll actually see a mixture of this being used in battleship gun turrets. Sometimes the men will load it, they'll stand away from the gun, and the gun will just fire. So that's the electrical detonation method. And sometimes, even on 12, 14-inch guns, etc., you'll see somebody actually pull a lanyard and bang, off it goes. And indeed, when I get around to doing one of the videos I have planned on the Atlantic wall defences on the island of Jersey and the Channel Islands, we actually came across a fairly large caliber gun, naval gun, that the Germans had repurposed for coastal defence, and that still had the percussion style lanyard pull to detonate it, set up, even though it was a slightly older gun by World War II standards. By World War II, pretty much everyone had gone over to the electrical firing method, but with the electrical firing method, of course, sometimes it might fail for various reasons, so almost all electrically fired primers will still have a backup percussion mode if you need to. Rob Smith asks, the Cornish, amongst other coastal communities, were renowned for their use of false beacons and the like to lure merchant ships to their fate. Were there ever occasions when beacons or similar changed the course of a naval battle? So I think there's two things here. Firstly, whilst luring ships to their fate on the rocky shores of various coastlines almost certainly did happen, sometimes the reputations of various communities and so forth as wreckers deliberately engineering these things is a little bit overblown. I'm not saying it, as I said, I'm not saying it didn't happen at all, but sometimes it gets a little bit exaggerated in the telling. Not helped by the fact that the term wrecker can mean somebody who deliberately engineers the wreck of a ship by some form of false measure, usually lights or some other signal, but that it can also mean those who recover things from shipwrecks. And so, the latter group may be doing that entirely legitimately. They may just happen to live on a coast that happens to suffer a lot of shipwrecks. And then you've got to factor in the other point, which is that once insurance and so forth comes into the mix, if you are a ship's captain and you have run your ship aground and lost the ship and a good chunk of its cargo, which is it going to be easier to explain to the ship's owners and the insurance if you say, well, yeah, I screwed up, I made a navigation error, and that's why the ship is now in pieces on the ocean floor, in which case, guess who's liable? You. Or is it easier to say, well, there were some false lights on shore, and, when we ran aground, a bunch of the locals came out and stole everything, so there's nothing to report, but also it's not my fault, because if they hadn't shown false lights, we wouldn't have mistakenly run aground there. In which case the liability is on a nebulous local community who probably won't speak to outsiders about the incident because, hey, they probably did make off with a bunch of ill-gotten goods from the wreck, which technically they should have reported, but they don't want to. Now, with all that aside, as I said, admitting that this probably did happen at times, were there occasions when false beacons or other false signals with regards to land changed the course of a naval battle? Not that I'm aware of for any significant major battles. Apart from anything, it's actually quite difficult to engineer a strong enough light signal in a way that would deceive a ship in a weather that they wouldn't otherwise easily recognize the deception. So yes, a smaller quality of light might deceive ships, some kind of vaguely portable lantern in calm weather, but in calm weather they will probably see and or hear the coastline, whereas in storms, where they might be deceived as to the location of a lighthouse that they might be looking for on a map or something and thus run into the coast elsewhere, you're going to need a considerably stronger light to be seen in the first place. But there are a number of cases where the presence or lack of presence of beacons did affect the course of a naval battle, false or not. And one example that easily comes to mind is the fight between the Indefatigable and Amazon versus the French ship of the line Droit de l'Homme. So that's two British frigates versus a French ship of the line. Towards the end of that battle, all three ships had actually drifted into a bay in the middle of the storm, which would result in the wreck of both Amazon and Droit de l'Homme. And the main reason that Indefatigable survived was because Indefatigable alone of the ships recognized the danger of the situation they were in early enough to be able to haul around and get out of there. There's some question as to whether the rather damaged and wallowing Droit de l'Homme would have been able to recover its situation anyway, even if it had realised things at the same time as Indefatigable. But certainly Amazon, being a smaller and lighter frigate than even Indefatigable, which was a Rasé, should have been able to get clear of the rocks, etc., if it had realised things at the same time as Pellew did. And finally, we have what are some good book recommendations for a young child to read if they're interested in naval history? Well, I suppose it depends on how you define young child, but drawing from my own experience, which may be slightly slanted because I was a very advanced reader for my age, but nonetheless, the old Ladybird series, I don't know if that's around in the States, but certainly it was in the UK quite a bit. There was a Ladybird series of books, and they covered both battles, but also there were quite a lot of biographical ones. They're relatively small, almost pocket-sized books, relatively low page count, but the language was clear and simple, not too many words, but also not too few. So you did have to be able to read to a certain degree. And they had a very nice layout of essentially having a page of information with a corresponding picture on the opposite page. So for a child, you'd be like, oh, I'm reading about this. Oh, well, that's what, roughly speaking, was going on. Fantastic. I don't know if they're still in print. I haven't seen huge numbers of them around these days. But there's probably I know there's a pretty decent secondhand market for them, and some have been released, re-released, updated, etc. In this format, which you can see on screen, with a Lady Expert book. So it's the Ladybird Expert series, and as you can see in this case, this is the Battle of Trafalgar by Dr. Sam Willis, who does the Mariner's Mirror podcast series on YouTube, and also very kindly allowed me to use the 3D models of the K-class submarines that you saw in the K-class video. And he's done Trafalgar, the Nile, and the Spanish Armada. So that would be kind of, I would suggest maybe someone, again, for me, this was what I was reading when I was 4 or 5. So, give or take a little bit on that. Then another set, again drawing on my own experience, which might be for perhaps a little bit later on, maybe when they're 7, 8, 9, something like that. I would highly recommend actually Julian Thompson's pair of books, the Imperial War Museum Book of the War at Sea and the corresponding World War I edition, because the first one is about World War II. And the reason I would recommend that is because it gives a relatively brief and easy to understand summary of what was going on in those conflicts, without going into too much depth, which could confuse a small child. And then it presents the rest of what was going on in the various actions that it describes from the accounts of people who were actually there, which of course means, again, it's people speaking, it's mostly sailors, and some officers. So with the greatest respect, it's not high academic. So it's understandable, but gives plenty of detail at the same time. Those, I think at least, would be pretty good starters for your, under 10s if they've got the reading comprehension. And, okay, that is a little bit of a British-centric perspective, but hey, I grew up in Britain. Quelle surprise. So if you have similar things, if there's a series on, I don't know, John Paul Jones for the US audience, albeit, having done the Battle of Flamborough Head, maybe not necessarily the best role model, but there you go. And I know there are a number of books out there that talk about the Second World War in particular, but a few other conflicts the US Navy's been involved in, again, using mostly the basic summary and then survivors' accounts format. I tend to find that those are actually quite good for kids to understand because, A, you've got multiple narratives so they don't get bored with a single one. B, as I said, it's not in high academic. It's not simple, but it's certainly understandable for a child. And also, obviously, parental discretion is advised, but generally speaking, these kinds of things, whilst they don't censor what they're saying, most of the time these books will make very minor edits to ensure the strongest sailor's language doesn't make it through. And that, as they say, is it for this episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Just a couple of minor things, actually, this time. So we ended up with actually a total of just over 40 people showing up for the tour of HMS Warrior and HMS Victory. Thank you very much if you are listening to those of you who showed up. It was a great time, even if the weather was undeniably foul. But, we persevered, and I think everybody enjoyed themselves. So thanks very much for that. In the new year, hopefully I will be expanding that. So, we shall see. Perhaps expanding not just Portsmouth, but also looking at maybe Belfast, Chatham, a few other places with maritime connections. And I am in talks with one or two other historians about maybe formalising this on a slightly larger basis so that we can also cover other sites of historical interest. Granted, given where we're all based, probably in the south of England, but that's not to say that we might not bring in others who can offer tours of other places, or when we're on various travels, potentially offer tours around various places, depending, of course, on the individual museums and ships and how much they're willing to tolerate for that kind of thing, because different museums have different policies on that kind of thing. But it was definitely an excellent start, and thanks again to everybody who showed up, and I hope you're all feeling much better now. Once you got out the rain and so forth. And the other thing to note right at the tail end, for those of you who are still listening, 1 hour and 10 minutes in, is if you've noticed there haven't been many live streams recently, there is a good reason for that. I haven't stopped doing them, apart from anything I owe a bunch of people on Patreon a bunch of alternate history questions being answered. The simple fact is health. So I obviously couldn't do the monthly live stream during September because I spent most of that in the USA. But unfortunately, I caught something on the 3 planes I had to take back from the US. Initially, I thought it was just plain flu, the way if you spend several hours up to half a day cooped up with several hundred people in a metal tube, you're probably going to catch something eventually. And initially, that seemed to all be done and dusted. It was over pretty quickly, a few days. But it did leave me with a periodic hacking cough. Now, that took 2 courses of antibiotics to bring under control, and it's still lingering very, very slightly. Not much. And it's not contagious, fortunately, but it is annoying. And that's why I haven't done the live streams during October and now getting into November, simply because if I'm going to sit there for 2 to 3 hours talking to you, you probably don't want me switching off the audio every 5 minutes to, hack away and bring up a lung or something. It's not quite that dramatic now, but it was for a little bit. So I'm hoping to restart the live streams and start playing catch up in the next week or so, but we shall see. So thank you very much for your forbearance if you are waiting for an alternate history Patreon question to be answered. But now you know, and for those of you who just enjoyed tuning in, now you know why I haven't been doing them as of late, but hopefully normal service will resume soon. So with all that said, once again, thanks very much for listening, and see you again in another video.